Hello, I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushen.
And this is the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast about all things city building in the speedy city of Denver. Well, everybody, today is a very special episode. We are joined by none other than Jill Locantore. Jill is the executive director for the Denver Streets Partnership, but she is basically a part of every single city building, street changing thing in our city. If you've noticed a change around Denver in the past 10 years, Jill had something to do with that. She's the Sidewalk Queen. Initiative 307 came from Jill. She's been instrumental in terms of getting Vision Zero to be a thing that our city focuses on. Our speed limits going from 25 to 20 on neighborhood streets, that originated with Jill. So I could go on and on about all the incredible things that, Jill, you have contributed to our city, but mostly just thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're really excited to talk to you today, Jill, because this is part 2 of a conversation that we're trying to, get people really focused on the podcast. So during part 1, we talked with Emily Kleinfelter, who now works for the city of Littleton, who used to be with Dr. Cog, and before that, I think, was with you guys.
She was, yes.
We had a great conversation about, at a regional level, what a MPO does, and then also what her job was with Dr. Cog as a Vision Zero person at Dr. Cog, and then at a suburban kind of street, in a rural street, how the Vision Zero context is different. But we really wanted to start from outside and come in, because everything starts in Denver in some essential way. We are the reason that Thornton is still growing, because of proximity to the big city that is Denver. We are the place where we have the most money for engineering our streets, even if the engineers constantly say it's not enough money. It is the most money. And it is an opportunity to really set the tone and drive a shift across the metro area. So we're supported by metro area partners. We had some great information from Emily about that, but we really just wanted to focus in with you about what is actually encountered on the streets in Denver. So I think just to level set, Vision Zero in Denver, we've been a Vision Zero city since 2017, right?
Correct.
In that time, how many hundreds of people have died on our streets? It's like 400 odd people or something?
It's, I think, at this point, approaching 600.
Approaching 600 people.
Yeah.
And so the fact that, as we talked about in our last episode, sure, the majority of crashes and injuries are actually happening across the metro area outside of the city and county of Denver, but Denver has really particular conditions. And when someone gets hit by a car in Denver, the most common kind of crash ends up with hitting people outside of the vehicle in Denver streets, I think is how I read that information from Emily.
Actually, the majority of deaths, I believe, are people in cars.
Okay.
Like, our streets are unsafe for everybody, no matter what mode. Your likelihood of being hit and killed is much higher if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist. In fact, people walking are 30 times more likely to be killed in a traffic crash than a person in a car. But not as many people walk as drive, partly because it's so unsafe to do so right now.
So then you have a great way of sort of talking about the problem on Denver streets, and I'm going to say it to you as I remember it, but you catch me if I miss any part, that we simply have in Denver too many vehicles that are too big and tall, driving too fast on streets that were built too wide.
That's exactly right. The problem is that simple.
I think what was helpful for me the first time I ever heard you say that, probably at one of these Vision Zero kind of memorials, what was helpful for me was at no point in there is a series of mistakes made by a given driver. It's a system. Too many vehicles. The vehicles are of a certain size that's too big on streets that are too fast, that are built too wide. There are people in there that can make those changes. You could choose to drive a smaller vehicle or choose to drive slower, but the point no longer is saying, well, people make bad choices. It's about analyzing the situation. So we thought today that we'd talk through Vision Zero in the Denver context by really going through that list of 4 facts and kind of breaking down how they came to be, what we're doing about them, and what more needs to be done. Who controls these kinds of things. Does that sound good to you?
Makes perfect sense.
Okay. So I think the first one is something that's come up between James and I a couple times now. Too many vehicles. And that's in a couple ways. Like, that might be your local street. You just think like, gosh, why do so many people drive down this street? I don't live on a main street. There's no businesses here. Why are all these people here? People feel that all the time when they're thinking about, let's say Adams or Monroe, just off of Colfax, for instance, their complaints about all the people driving on their streets. How does anyone control the number of vehicles on a road? And what can we do to change the number of vehicles on a road?
Yeah, it's not a law of nature that driving is the only way that human beings can get around. We've had cities for thousands of years that were built around people using their own power, walking, biking, and then public transit to get around. And it's only like in the last 100 years or so that we have designed our cities around cars to the extent that we have forced people to use cars or trucks to get where they need to go, because that's the only viable option that's been made available to them. But we can undo that. We can redesign our transportation system to actually make ways other than driving completely safe and convenient ways to get around. Both of those are key. It's one thing to make walking safe, but if you have to walk 2 miles out of your way to get to your destination, that's not convenient, and nobody's going to choose to do that. So it's investing in safe and direct ways for people to walk, bike, and take transit is a key part of the solution too, because people need a variety of options. Walking might work for some trips, biking might work for other trips. If you need to go a longer distance, transit is the best way to, and the safest way to do that. And in fact, since the city of Denver committed to Vision Zero, there have been 0 fatalities of people riding transit.
Oh, wow.
I mean, we said earlier, we're approaching probably 600 people who've died in traffic crashes since 2017. 0 of those people were riding transit. It is truly the safest way to get around, but it's not convenient for most people today because we have not invested in the level of service that people need for it to be practical for them to get to their daily destination. Part of that is infrastructure. If we provide dedicated space on our streets for buses, that means they can go faster. They don't get caught in congestion. But we also need the buses to come frequently, right? Like, a lot of our buses only come once an hour. They only come during weekdays and office hours, basically, like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. But we need to be able to travel on the weekends and in the evenings, and we don't want to have to wait 45 minutes for the next bus to come. So investing in transit service that comes so frequently, you don't even need to look up the schedule. You can just walk to the nearest bus stop, and a bus is going to come in the next 5 to 10 minutes. If we achieve that in the Denver area, that's going to dramatically change the choices that people make in terms of whether they drive or they want to use one of these other modes to get around.
When we think about some of those things, you're talking about changing the types of trip that are available for people to make, rethinking our neighborhoods so that you can walk to whatever destination, rethinking those longer destinations so they can be bikeable, and rethinking even longer destinations so you have frequent transit service to get there. A lot of these things seem tied up in the issue of density, right? That you can change zoning code all you want to allow a corner store to go in, but if somebody doesn't think that corner store is economically viable because there aren't a lot of people living in the area, no one's going to open it. And you can't run transit service with 10-minute headways to something where there's 5 people per square mile unless you want to just dump money down the drain. And so are we talking about just increasing density in our cities? How does this look for somebody who lives maybe in far southeast Denver? What does the intersection of Vision Zero and density look like outside of the downtown core?
Yeah, land use is absolutely the other side of the coin of transportation investments. And in fact, there's a saying in urban planning that land use is the best transportation plan by allowing people to live close enough to transit and good bike and pedestrian networks, and close enough to the destinations that they're trying to get to that those modes are practical for them. And the reality is Denver is growing, and we constantly need to be adding more housing. And so we can double down on low density development patterns and more single family homes that are spread out, or we can focus that growth around transit corridors and in areas where there's opportunity for infill and redevelopment to increase density and make walking and biking and transit more practical for those people. There's some fantastic opportunities right now in central Denver. There is so much land today that's just like surface parking lots.
Yeah.
If you think about Ball Arena, if you think about, the Elitch amusement park area, the stadium district around the Broncos Stadium, today, that land is kind of like a void in the middle of Denver, but there's a huge amount of planning going on for repurposing those empty parking lots into mixed-use development with both housing and commercial. And so it's an opportunity for us to redesign the transportation system around that central part of Denver to really reprioritize transit, walking, and biking as a primary mode for people to get around. It's going to become a nightmare if everybody has to drive to and from that areas, and it's going to just overload the limited street space that we have. So it's really critical for us to be thinking about both land use and transportation as we're trying to solve these problems.
And I think what I heard you say there is sort of these things need to feed into one another, where it's like we need to build up rich transit and active and public transportation solutions along high density areas. And then we need to identify where we have transit and bike path and other types of corridors and increase density there as well. We can increase density everywhere in Denver, but like targeting those places first, right? Along BRT, along bike paths, along these things is going to have greater yield, perhaps.
Yeah, and sometimes we can get caught up in the chicken and egg problem, right? Well, we can't invest in transit here because we don't have enough density yet. Or we can't add density here because we don't have good enough transit to support it. And the reality is you just need to get started. And there's going to be a little bit of pain points here and there where you have density but not yet transit, or transit but not yet density. But over time, if you just continue to invest and encourage both, we'll start moving in the right direction. So it requires being willing to be uncomfortable for moments at time when, things are misaligned, but supportive of the general path that we're moving towards, which is matching our land use and transportation together in a way that really reduces our dependency on driving as the primary mode of transportation.
So the next part of the phrase, once we start to get people maybe out of some of those vehicles, well, the problem is that the vehicles are too big and too tall. Talk a little bit about the size of vehicles and how that affects that. And then I think, in particular, something that we heard in our last episode from Emily is that this can be a really depressing part. This is something that we maybe lack some amount of local control over, the size of the vehicle that GM decides to debut for the 2025, vehicle season. So what do we have control over? What's changing in that arena, and what more needs to change, with the size of vehicles?
Yeah, there's a very clear correlation between the increasing size and weight and height of vehicles that are being made available for consumers to buy and increasing pedestrian fatalities. The taller a vehicle is, the more likely it will hit a pedestrian in the chest or the head, as opposed to hitting them on the leg, and therefore it'll be a much more serious injury or fatality. The heavier the vehicle is, the longer it takes them to stop, and the greater the impact. I mean, it's just basic physics. Taller vehicles also have less visibility. You may have seen these demonstrations where they have kids stand up in front of a vehicle, and if it has a very tall hood, the driver can't see those children. Like, you might have a dozen children lined up in front of the car, and maybe the driver can see the 12th child. But the lack of visibility just means they don't even know that there's a hazard that they should be avoiding. And you're absolutely right. There's only so much that local governments can do to regulate vehicle design. Ultimately, this needs to come from the federal government. And there's some movement on that front. Congress just introduced a bill that would require safety ratings to consider pedestrians when you're designing vehicles, not just the safety of the passengers within the vehicle, but also thinking about what is the risk to pedestrians outside of the vehicle. That would be a first in the US for us to require manufacturers to even consider people outside of the vehicle. But there's also things that can happen at the state and local level, too. California just passed a law. The governor still needs to sign it. Hopefully he will. This relates to speeding of vehicles, but this law would require cars to have a warning system. If you're going more than 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, it'll start beeping at you. Just like if you don't put on your seatbelt, your car will beep at you. It's very effective. It's annoying when somebody's beeping at you. You want to make the beep stop. So it's a very simple vehicle design issue that would make our streets safer. California is able to mandate that at the state level. And then there are other cities that impose fees based on vehicle weight. Like Washington, D.C. has a registration fee that varies depending on how big the vehicle is. And so it just creates an incentive. If you're concerned about saving money, you might be incentivized to buy a smaller vehicle, so you pay that smaller fee. And they can also lead by example. New York City has done a great job at looking at its own fleet of vehicles and how can they retrofit their existing vehicles or change the type of vehicles that they're buying so that they're safer on the streets. And that creates market demand and can influence an overall shift in the market. So it does require action at all levels of government, but there is a role to play definitely at the local level.
And something that you folks have done at DSP that I found really interesting, you had a pilot recently for freight delivery. I think that's another part that's a little uncomfortable sometimes as urbanists, is we kind of maybe to our peril ignore that there are services being provided on our doorstep all the time, or that walkable restaurant that we love. Look, they got to get their produce from somewhere. So this is always going to be part of it. How does freight delivery happen? Well, it doesn't all happen like in America, where it's a big tractor trailer that just kind of rumbles down the street in order to unload in an alley. You can go to other cities and they have other restaurants where they're not being served by a tractor trailer. Do you want to talk a little bit about what DSP did to see how freight delivery could be different?
Yeah, so this was a partnership with the city's Department of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency, CASR. They provided some grant funding for us to do a pilot program to determine whether using e-bikes for delivery was an option that would work for businesses. And this was really focused at small, locally owned businesses. There's larger delivery systems that involve companies like Amazon, and there's been other pilots in other parts of the country about getting those big corporate entities to use e-bikes. We were focused on small, local businesses. So we signed up a bakery and a pizza place and a florist and just granted them a bike in exchange for them recording data on how much were they using that to support their delivery needs and how much of those trips were replacing vehicular trips. And the success stories were phenomenal in terms of the businesses saying it was saving them money. It was actually enjoyable. Instead of having to deal with traffic and trying to find parking, it was actually pleasant to be out biking around doing these deliveries. And it was great marketing for them because they could put their logo on the side of their big e-cargo bikes, and there's so much interest in e-cargo bikes that people would stop them and ask them about their businesses. And so it was just a great proof of concept that, especially in this context of small locally owned businesses that need to do deliveries, e-cargo bikes can work for at least some of them and truly did replace and dramatically reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled in order to do those deliveries.
Well, that's really exciting. I didn't realize it was in conjunction with the city. I mean, that sounds like something, again, maybe we can't control, is not the right word, but incentivize, test, kind of instill maybe in a group of entrepreneurs and a population that it doesn't just have to be done by buying one of those sort of Sprinter vans in order to deliver your baked goods. No, that's really exciting.
On the subject of sustainability and environment, electric vehicles are thousands of pounds heavier than their ICE equivalent. And urbanists are often environmentalists. There's often a lot of interplay between how we design our streets and what environmentalists want. And I think that that's all well and good. But there's also a pretty large contingent of environmentalists who are fully on the EV train, or the EV SUV, as it might be. When you think about Vision Zero, and specifically when you talk to environmentalists about Vision Zero and electric vehicles, how do you encourage people to think about this? Because I think for a lot of folks, that's like man, if I could do one thing for the planet, it would be to purchase an EV and get rid of my old internal combustion vehicle and swap it that way. But if every vehicle on our street was an EV right now, we'd probably have more traffic deaths because those people would be getting hit by bigger vehicles, which have more momentum.
Yeah, air pollution is just one of the problems with cars. There's so many ways that cars and trucks are harmful to our urban environment. And as you mentioned, traffic violence is one of them. Electric vehicles tend to be heavier. They actually can accelerate faster, get from 0 to 60 in a blink of an eye, which is, part of why driving is just inherently such a dangerous way to be traveling. They also take up a lot of space that could be used for other purposes. Streets make up about 80% of the public space in our cities. And when we're using all of that space just to facilitate the movement and storage of vehicles, there's opportunity costs to that. It means that we can't have more trees and greenery, which is also good for the environment. It means we can't have wider sidewalks and dedicated bike lanes that make it possible for people to choose other modes. It means that we don't have more space for housing, right? The more you keep widening highways, often we're condemning housing to make those streets wider and wider. So it's thinking holistically about all the different ways that cars and trucks harm our environment. Yes, making them electric, it marginally addresses some of the problems, but it's not addressing the full range of problems that cars are creating.
And one of the things that I've talked about is where we must have a vehicle, let's make it an electric vehicle.
Absolutely.
But let's reduce the amount of occasions where we need a vehicle. A garbage truck is always going to come down your block to pick up garbage. There's never going to be a person on an e-bike doing that. Unless DSP has a really cool pilot in the works right now.
I don't know. You're getting my wheels turned.
Yeah. But does every city occasion need to be done with an SUV? Do all delivery businesses need to be using Sprinter vans? I think those are maybe the questions that can bubble up to the surface when we talk about the interplay between EVs and street safety.
Well, the other one, land use, going back to that one, when you go through Cap Hill, I think one of several things you experience is maybe a little bit of surprise at the smaller vehicle size. If you're going down South Lowell Boulevard through Harvey Park, you see a very different size of vehicle than if you're going down Logan Street in Capitol Hill. And I just truly say it's not because Capitol Hill people are like namby-pamby, but there's a competitive advantage. If you have a smaller car and
you're more
less
likely
on-street
to find
parking,
a spot.
you're more likely to find a spot.
Yeah.
So I think some amount of the land use change also really reflects this possibility as well. We have these big cars that are kind of considered like comfort places when what you do is you get from the exterior part of a city into the downtown in that sort of comfortable space. Your large car is that big comfortable thing for you. But if you actually don't use your car that much, there's not really the same kind of premium for you about the square footage of your vehicle. And especially if there's a pain to parking and moving parking and finding parking and backing into that parking and whatnot, I think a smaller vehicle is a competitive advantage. So there are ways, I think, to consider that is within a certain amount of influence.
And vehicle size is not entirely market driven. I think there's this perception that consumers want these bigger vehicles. And that's maybe partly true for the reasons you said. It feels more comfortable. People feel safer inside the vehicle when it's really big, even if it's dangerous to people outside of the vehicle. But ironically, the federal regulations around tailpipe emissions have incentivized bigger vehicles because there's different standards for sedans versus SUVs were classified differently when the federal government established their tailpipe emission standards, because trucks and SUVs are supposedly needed for, farms or industrial purposes that need these larger trucks, but it created a loophole for just your average resident to be able to purchase an SUV that had less fuel efficiency. And so the industry was incentivized to create more and more SUVs. They account for more and more car sales. That's not because that's what people want. That's an artifact of these weird policy loopholes that were created.
Truly, the littlest things make the biggest difference sometimes, right? Let's talk about the next part of this. So there's too many vehicles, and they're too big and tall. They're driving too fast. I think one thing, again, we've talked about this in other episodes, but if you are just a regular person on the street, or you're out front of your house and you're talking to your neighbor or something like that, or you're out front of your apartment talking to your friend on the stoop, the thing that you notice whenever it happens is that moment when someone drives way too fast on your street. You feel it, you see it, you're like, whoa, that's crazy. The speed of vehicles is something people immediately respond to. And you have already mounted a really successful, not you, I mean, you personally, yes, absolutely, but the work that DSP has done to mount this campaign to change the speed of vehicles, the default speed limit in Denver. Talk about why that was necessary and kind of what speed does, in this case.
Yeah, speed is pretty much the number one factor that determines whether a crash is going to happen and whether it results in a serious injury or fatality. The faster a driver is going, it narrows their field of vision. They're focused further down the road. They're less likely to see in the periphery pedestrians or bicyclists that might be approaching. It takes longer for them to stop. And then obviously if they hit somebody at high speed, it's just, again, it's physics. It's greater impact and your chances of dying are just so much higher if a car is going more than about 20 miles per hour. Ultimately, the most effective way to reinforce safe speeds is through street design. So the narrower the street, the more friction there is on the street, both from the sides, whether it's parked cars or street trees or bulb outs, or vertical friction, speed humps, or actual barriers like mini traffic circles. All of these things really reinforce slower speeds. We advocated for the city to reduce the default speed limit, partly to justify those street designs. Basically, traffic engineers will ask, okay, what is the speed limit on this corridor? Okay, we will design the street to reflect that desired speed. Yeah. So if you're designing a street for 60 miles per hour, you're going to design it very differently than you are for 20 miles per hour. And there's even a difference between 25 miles per hour, which was the city's previous default speed limit, and 20 miles per hour. You're more likely to use things like speed humps. You might make the speed humps taller to really reinforce those slow speeds. And then there's the element of enforcement. And again, ideally, the street should be self-enforcing. Like the designs are so robust that it's really hard to drive above the speed limit, and you don't need police officers or any other type of enforcement. But in the interim, before we can implement all of those street design changes, there is still a role for enforcement, and the data is very clear that automated enforcement, so using cameras that detect how fast the car is going and then issues a ticket to the owner of the car, is the most effective way to reinforce safe speeds, because it's 24/7, 365 days a year. If you're relying on police officers, it's necessarily spotty, random enforcement. But if every time you drive down a particular street, if you're going over the speed limit, you're going to get a ticket, and it's well advertised with lots of signage. Right. People are very quick to catch on and change their behavior so they don't get a ticket in the first place, which is truly the intention, is to reinforce and change the long-term behavior patterns.
And again, like I say, I think this is one of the ones that's most intuitive in some way for people. They know when they hear, for instance, some streamer drove from Denver to Colorado Springs in like 25 minutes, going 125 miles an hour, like that crazy story. People just hear that and go, wow, what a psycho. We just know that there is such a thing as moving too fast. A part of this, though, this has been in the news recently, that the big initiative here that the new mayor and his new leadership, Doty, is doing this speed program. That, as I understand it, really does focus on arterial streets and reducing speed. But I actually don't really understand the basic points of that program. Can you run me through that one? Do you know that one, either of you?
Yeah, so basically the mayor and Amy Ford, the new director of transportation for the city, announced that they're reconfirming the city's commitment to Vision Zero and the goal of eliminating traffic fatalities, and a renewed focus on speed as one of the primary factors, with a focus specifically on two of the most dangerous streets in the city, Federal Boulevard and Alameda Avenue, which I think also were deliberately chosen because they're on the west side of Denver, which has just historically received much less investment and has much more dangerous street designs than other parts of the city. And so kind of recognizing that historical wrong that needs to be corrected. And there's a few different things that they're looking at on those corridors in the near term. including changes to signal timing. So, for example, if you're going over the speed limit, you're just going to constantly hit red lights. But if you're actually going the speed limit, you'll get rewarded with hitting green lights. So you can just flow slowly and zen-like down the corridor and have a pleasant experience. Simply increasing the signage to reinforce what the actual speed is. And then, to me, most importantly, is actually implementing automated speed enforcement on these corridors, which was not possible under state law until just recently, when they liberalized the conditions under which cities are allowed to use automated speed enforcement. Previously, they weren't allowed to use them on our most dangerous streets, our arterials, because they were limited to quiet residential streets, which should also be safe, but where these are needed most are streets like Federal Boulevard. So their intention is to test out using automated speed enforcement on Federal Boulevard and Alameda. And, once they demonstrate that is actually effective, the idea is that we could expand it to other high injury network streets across the city. And then our hope, but this wasn't necessarily part of the mayor's announcement, is that they will then follow that up with actual street design changes that reinforce safe speeds on those corridors.
That was going to be my question, because I think that the moving the 25 to 20 miles an hour, some people see that and they say, well, they just changed the signs around town. Nobody looks at those anyway, which is like, whatever. People maybe don't understand that this does affect the engineering decisions. And when I ride north on Perry Street above Sloan's Lake toward wherever I'm going, I'm hitting speed bumps. I'm hitting pinch points. There's the mini roundabouts. I'm like, this street, I want every neighborhood street to look like this. This is fantastic. And you know what? People go quite slow there. They recognize that me on my bike, I'm an equal player on the street to them. And it's high comfort. And it didn't used to be. When I would ride that street in 2017, 2018, it was a lot less comfortable. But then when I look at this stuff that they're doing on Federal and Alameda, those same design decisions aren't taking place. And I just wonder, how effective do you think this is going to be? If we make the speed limit sign bigger, and we change the timing of the street lights, some of which may have speed enforcement, some of which won't. If we're not actually changing the physical condition of the roadway, what do you think the effect is going to be on safety, on how people speed?
Yeah, I do think especially the automated enforcement will be impactful. But it's not enough by itself. We do have to change the design of these streets. And these streets are fundamentally different from neighborhood streets, where treatments like speed humps and mini traffic circles are a logical way to reinforce safe speeds on those streets. For these huge arterials like Federal Boulevard, it's very different because they're practically a football field in width, right? There's 6 to 8 lanes of traffic on those streets. And this gets to the last part of the sentence. Our streets are too wide, right? When you have a street that's designed like a highway, it's super wide, it's got multiple lanes of traffic. People are going to drive like it's a highway, and they're going to go 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. You see that all the time on Federal Boulevard. And what you need to do is start reclaiming that space so that there are fewer lanes for cars. There's less exposure for people who are trying to get from one side of the street to the other. They don't have to cross a whole football field. They can cross a shorter distance, and it just naturally, psychologically causes drivers to go slower if they're in a more constrained space. And the good news is that CDOT is currently leading a planning process for Federal Boulevard that's looking at bus rapid transit, where we would take existing general purpose travel lanes and convert them into dedicated bus lanes. That would start doing exactly what I'm talking about in terms of narrowing down the parts of the street that's just used for general vehicular traffic and making the street safer for everybody. The challenge is, it's unclear how true we're going to stay to making it truly bus rapid transit on that corridor, which means dedicated bus lanes, and doing that by repurposing existing travel lanes. What CDOT has currently been contemplating is not having a dedicated lane on a big stretch of the corridor from 20th to 50th, and then in the southern portion of the corridor actually widening the street in order to add a dedicated bus lane, which completely negates the safety benefits of repurposing existing lanes for the bus. So there's a lot of discussions that still need to happen that will determine how truly dramatic are the changes we're making to these corridors. But the conversation is at least happening about rethinking what does a federal boulevard look like. And that's starting to happen on other corridors too. Colorado Boulevard is the next one in the queue for considering bus rapid transit. The city of Denver is looking at 38th Avenue for bus rapid transit. The Denver Regional Council of Governments is leading a planning effort focused on Alameda. So there's a lot of conversations happening. And the question is, how bold are we ready to be as a city of Denver to truly rethink the design of these major arterial streets that are the backbone of our transportation system? Because if we want to get to zero traffic fatalities, we have to change these streets and how they function.
If you're having trouble, listener at home, imagining what these kind of streets in this idyllic zero fatalities world look like, where would I go for an early glimpse of that in Denver? You know, what have we done so far that we actually have seen like makes a big difference on certain streets? I mean, like I used to live on just off of Santa Fe Drive, and when I moved to that neighborhood, it was like January of 2020, and it was 3 lanes, and there was just the teeniest sidewalks in the world on Santa Fe Drive. And just in August, when I was there for the one time a year that they closed down the street to do Art Walk, you know, on Santa Fe Drive, north of 6th, south of 13th, oh my gosh, A, it was fabulous, and B, there was somebody from the city there that was talking about, like, you know, they had a pilot where it was 2 lanes. That went well. People liked it. People loved it. And now they're going to make that permanent with infrastructure. Is that kind of like our perfect vision, or are there other good examples in Denver that you really like for, you know, showing people what this change can be?
Yeah, the good news is we do have more and more examples of what this could look like, particularly downtown. I think people forget how quickly, when change happens, what it used to be like. If you look at the numbered streets downtown, 15th, 17th, 18th, 19th, gradually over the last several years, the city has been adding both bus lanes and protected bike lanes to those streets downtown. So now if you look at 17th Street, it used to be 5 lanes, I think, of general purpose traffic, which is wild for downtown. Like, we should never have streets that wide in a downtown area. But now it's, you know, it's one of these streets that has the double wide dedicated bus lane. It's got a protected bike lane and has just 2 lanes for cars. And you know what? It works just fine. Right. I bike along that route every time. I used to bike when I had to bike just in a general purpose travel lane, and it was terrifying. Now it's very comfortable because I have a protected bike lane. And sure, the traffic is moving slowly, which is what we want in downtown Denver. We want it to be slow so it's safe for everybody, but it still flows just fine. And I drive down 17th Avenue too. You know, I think it's ridiculous that we categorize people as like bicyclists or drivers.
Right.
Like, most people use different forms of transportation. I use different forms of transportation. So I've experienced these streets both as a driver and as a bicyclist, and they work fine. Another example is Broadway, where we have, for many years, we've had a dedicated bus lane on Broadway since the 70s. Can you imagine? Like,
what forward-thinking progressives, you know.
Right.
And now we have a dedicated bike lane. And again, the world has not fallen apart. Like, traffic still moves down that corridor. It moves slower, which is a good thing, and it still moves. People are still getting where they need to go. We've had Santa Fe, where they've reduced the number of lanes. Just over the last month, they've been repurposing York adjacent to City Park, reducing the number of travel lanes. And I very deliberately walked my dog this morning up York Street to experience what it was like during rush hour. Traffic was flowing, but it was moving slowly. And you know what? It was quieter.
Yeah.
Normally when I walk my dog in City Park, I avoid York because it's so loud and unpleasant. I want to get deeper into the park so I can get away from the traffic noise. But this morning I was like, oh, this is kind of nice.
There's a great podcast out there about urban noise that people can go check out on,
really?
on a little known.
What number was that? Was that number 5?
I don't know. Yeah. I think something that you're talking about here is a really cool trick of history, is that back in the day, the city said, you know what we need? We need huge roads to do basically highways down every block. And now we're like, okay, that's actually dumb, and it's costing lives, and it's costing all of, you know, the opportunity cost that you mentioned earlier. But now we have this like super cool opportunity, because the city doesn't need to go in eminent domain some home and tear it down. It's like the right of way is the city's to do with whatever they please. And so as you shrink a 4-lane to a 2-lane, now you have dozens of feet of space. That could be trees, that could be sidewalks. With this new sidewalk ordinance that you had a little something to do with, there are going to be times when the city probably needs to shrink the roadway in order to build those sidewalks. And it's like the fact that we own all that right of way already and we don't need to like knock on a door and say, I got bad news, you got to move, we're building a sidewalk here. Like that is a huge opportunity for the city, even if it was a result of some pretty insane choices in history.
That's exactly the way to think about it. When we're talking about streets like Federal Boulevard or Colorado Boulevard or Broadway, there is so much space. And people got to experience that with Viva Streets, right? When we said, cars, for today, you're not allowed on Broadway. We're just going to have people walking and biking. And it was kind of wild because so many people turned out. We had like 10,000 people that showed up. And yet it still felt sparse. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. Because there's so much space. As soon as you start removing cars from that space, you realize, oh my gosh, there's so much space. There's so much we could be doing. And so we should think of that as an asset. It's been a challenge. It's what's made these streets dangerous. But it's this huge opportunity to rethink how we're using that space. Like you said, without having to touch private property. It's completely under the city's control.
Can I just share an anecdote here? I was in Dublin kind of recently. And in Dublin, what their sort of progressive step forward here is that they've been taking away a lane of traffic. But in Dublin, it's very common for it to be a bus and bike lane. But also the bus lane can be used by like taxis and freight vehicles. So I saw a lot of cyclists in Dublin who I guess are comfortable with that. But like that seems crazy to me that we're like putting cyclists in competition with like freight vehicles or whatever. Right. So again, I think obviously Dublin is amazing. I'm not going to diss the city, but we have an opportunity here, as James puts it. This would be an opportunity to add something to your neighborhood, not to take it away. Taking away the flow of traffic on one lane of 17th Avenue or something like that, that doesn't ruin the street. That gives a business a place to put out a new table. That makes it quiet enough for you to have a conversation with your friend without, having to move indoors or off the street. That gives an opportunity for more trees in some of the parts of town that really need them most. All of these things can happen when we accept that a transformation to the streets are needed already. I wanted to ask one more question. We've been going for so long here. This is wonderful. But I wanted to ask one more question. What is like some territory that we have not even like considered in Denver? Like, are there any like big kind of policy things that, we've got the state on board with BRT now. Amazing. Fantastic. That's amazing. The city is now going to be paying and providing sidewalks. Amazing. Fantastic. What's the next new kind of transformative thing that we can really try and sink our teeth into and consider to change roads?
Yeah, one missing piece still is funding for transit service. Mm-hmm. We're making progress on reallocating street space to have dedicated lanes for the bus. And there's still a lot of battles to be fought, as we were talking about with Federal Boulevard. Like, are they really going to dedicate a lane for the bus along the whole corridor or not? So we got to still work on that. But once we have the dedicated lane, it's not very useful if the bus only comes every 30 minutes. Sure. Right? Sure. And that comes down to money for bus operations, and it needs to be permanent dedicated funding. Whereas, capital projects, building new infrastructure, that's a one-time expense. But the bus runs every day, and we need money every day to keep the buses running more frequently. We had a win in last year's legislative session with the new oil and gas fee that will provide some dedicated funding for transit operations statewide. Some of it will be allocated by formula to local transit agencies like RTD. I believe RTD should be receiving about $50 to $60 million a year to support transit operations, which is a great first step. We estimate that we need more on the order of like $240 million a year additional investment in transit service to get to the point where the vast majority of Denver residents live within walking distance of a bus line that comes every 5 to 10 minutes all day, every day. And that's when we get to the point where it's truly practical to take transit wherever you need to go. And that's a viable option for you instead of driving. So that's one big area A small thing that would be totally new, but I think would really start the ball rolling in Denver, is if the city started deploying intelligent speed assistance in its vehicles that it owns. So it's a pretty simple technology. It's literally been around since cars were initially invented. When cars were first invented, they actually had speed governors on them that prevented them from going above a certain speed because people recognized how dangerous it was. The automobile industry fought against that, and eventually they were no longer standard equipment. But now 100 years later, we've got even more sophisticated technology that can regulate how fast a car can go. Like we were saying, in California, it could just beep at you if you're going over the speed limit. In Europe, there are new standards where it just gets harder. You have to press harder on the gas pedal once you're going over the speed limit. And these are very effective systemic design solutions that prevent people from going over the speed limit and reinforce those safe speeds. And again, New York City has been a leader in this, where they've started piloting in their fleet vehicles having intelligent speed assistance. I would love to see Denver do the same thing. It's such a small thing, but it's a big cultural shift of saying, you know what? It's just not safe to go over the speed limit. We can control it. Here's a simple thing that we can do to prevent that from happening.
Plus, it frees up a lot of that bumper space that's currently taken up by, how's my driving? Call so-and-so, We can start having more honor students in Denver again. That'll be wonderful.
Yeah. The critical lack of bumper space is a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. No one's talking about it.
Mayor Justin ran on that. Well, I think, we could probably continue to chat for another, hour and a half or whatever, but your time is precious. Much more precious than ours. I just wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast. And is there anything that you want people to be aware of right now? As an advocacy organization, I'm sure there's things that you would like people to be engaged with. Is there anything you want to point the people toward right now?
Yes, there are upcoming meetings on Federal Boulevard BRT, Colorado Boulevard BRT, and Evans Avenue is another city project where they're looking at safety improvements on Evans Avenue. The most important thing, people always want to say, how can I be part of the solution? Show up and use your voice and say, safety and livability of my city is more important to me than the speed and convenience of driving. And I support reallocating public space away from cars and for other things. That is the number one most important thing somebody could do personally to advocate for Vision Zero.
Amazing. Well, I'll put some links in the show notes so people can click and find their way to how to get plugged in and how to start advocating in their community. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Jill. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks. You for having me.
Oh, thanks very much, Jill. The Denver Urbanism Podcast is a production of longtime blog Denver Infill and its sister blog, Denver Urbanism. You can find more information on denverurbanism.com, and we look forward to hearing your engagement online. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna get
You're in huge trouble. Get out of the studio.
I know.
Completely destroyed the momentum of the whole conversation.
Wow. We're all about a lot of momentum.
Well,